The metallic, jarring clang of a forged iron axe head rebounding off a piece of frozen cottonwood is a sound that haunted the Dakota Territory. On November 18th, 1880, at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, 16-year-old Elias Thorne stood ankle-deep in freezing mud, listening to that exact horrifying sound. The ambient temperature was hovering at 12 degrees, but the unrelenting wind howling out of the northwest at 28 miles per hour drove the wind chill well below zero. A freezing sleet storm had been punishing the plains for 3 days, coating everything in a translucent, impenetrable armor of ice. And as Elias swung the axe again, feeling the shockwave vibrate painfully up his forearms to his shoulders, he knew the brutal arithmetic of the frontier. Wood is life, and frozen wood is a death sentence.
Keep your distance.
Across the sprawling, desolate 160-acre homesteads of the plains, winter was not merely a season. It was an apex predator. It hunted the unprepared, the arrogant, and the poorly provisioned. To survive a Dakota winter, a homesteader required absolute mastery over their environment. Yet, as Elias dropped his axe and began shoveling wet, heavy earth to excavate a trench measuring exactly 4 feet deep by 12 feet long, the sounds of laughter carried over the howling wind. Silas Vance, a wealthy neighboring cattleman wrapped heavily in a buffalo hide coat, sat atop his thoroughbred horse, watching the boy dig. Silas had a massive, traditional woodpile stacked proudly beside his 2-story clapboard house. 8 cords of premium, kiln-dried oak, imported by rail. "You burying that firewood like a dead dog, boy?" Silas's voice boomed, dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who equated wealth with wisdom. "You're going to rot every last timber down in that mud, and when January comes, I ain't burying your frozen corpse." Elias did not answer. He just kept digging. He understood something the wealthy cattleman did not. He knew that out here on the merciless plains, nature doesn't care about your pride. Out here, physics is the only judge that matters. Elias Thorne was entirely alone. Just 5 weeks prior, on October 12th, his father had succumbed to a rapid, suffocating bout of pneumonia. The illness had struck fast, stealing the elder Thorne's breath and leaving Elias as the sole custodian of their fragile homestead claim. The tragedy had brought more than just profound grief. It had brought immediate financial ruin. Between the $8.50 fee for the town doctor's futile visit and the $12 cost of rough-sawn pine boards for a respectable coffin, the Thorne family reserves had been decimated. Elias now held his entire net worth inside a rusted Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee tin hidden beneath the floorboards. Exactly 11:45. The arithmetic of survival was terrifyingly clear. A drafty 14 by 18-foot homesteader's cabin lost roughly 15,000 BTUs, British thermal units, per hour in 0-degree weather. To maintain a survivable internal temperature of 55 degrees, the cast-iron stove needed to burn continuously from November through April. That required a minimum of 8 cords of wood. In the nearby railroad town of Fargo, premium, seasoned hardwood was selling for $4.50 a cord. Elias needed $36 to buy survival. He had 11. All Elias had was his late father's plot of land and a dense grove of green, freshly felled cottonwood and green ash near the creek bed. But green wood is a deceptive, dangerous resource. A freshly cut cottonwood tree is essentially a standing pillar of water. Its cellular structure, composed of xylem and phloem, acts as a massive capillary system. When felled in late autumn, the moisture content of green cottonwood hovers around 45 to 50% by weight. Elias had hundreds of logs, but they were dripping with sap and trapped cellular water. And in the unforgiving cold of the Dakota plains, water was the enemy. The conventional wisdom of the frontier dictated a very specific method for firewood. Split it, stack it tightly against the exterior walls of the cabin to act as a windbreak, and leave the bark facing up to shed rain. It was the proper way. It was the way the wealthy cattlemen, the rigid clergymen, and the traditional builders all handled their fuel. But Elias understood the physics of failure hidden within this traditional method. When green, moisture-laden wood is stacked outdoors in the Dakotas, it falls victim to a lethal cycle. First, the autumn sleet storms coat the exposed pile. During brief midday thaws, when the sun hits the dark bark, the ice melts, and liquid water seeps deeply into the exposed end grain of the logs, traveling through the porous xylem. Then, when the sun sets and the temperature plummets by 20 degrees in a matter of hours, that internal water freezes solid. Water expands by about 9% when it freezes. Inside a log, this microscopic expansion locks the cellular structure into a solid, impenetrable block of ice. The wood becomes heavier than stone and completely incombustible. If a homesteader manages to drag a frozen, wet log inside and force it into a cast-iron stove, a catastrophic thermodynamic penalty occurs. Fire requires heat, oxygen, and fuel. But when introduced to frozen, wet wood, the fire must first expend its energy, its precious BTUs, just to change the physical state of the water. This is governed by the latent heat of vaporization. It takes exactly 970 BTUs of energy to convert 1 single pound of boiling water into steam. If a 20-pound frozen cottonwood log contains 8 pounds of water, the stove must consume nearly 8,000 BTUs of its own heat just to boil the log dry. Instead of radiating heat into the cabin to warm the freezing inhabitants, the fire turns inward. It smolders. It hisses. It drops the internal temperature of the firebox below the 250-degree threshold required for clean combustion. This incomplete combustion releases unburned volatile gases and heavy water vapor up the chimney, where it immediately condenses on the freezing iron stovepipe, creating thick, highly flammable creosote. The conventional method didn't just fail to keep a family warm, it actively stole heat from the room to boil frozen sap, leaving the homesteader shivering in the dark, breathing in acrid smoke while the frost crept up the interior walls. Elias knew that if he stacked his green cottonwood above ground like Silas Vance, the first deep freeze would turn his only fuel source into useless blocks of ice. He would freeze to death long before Christmas. He needed a radical, counterintuitive solution to season his timber in the dead of winter, stripping the moisture away while protecting the core temperature of the wood. He needed to abandon the sky and look to the earth. If you are the kind of person who values practical wisdom over popular opinion, subscribe to help preserve these frontier techniques. Also, comment below, which city are you watching from? By the morning of November 19, 1880, the biting sleet had temporarily given way to a brittle, overcast sky, the temperature stalling at a deceptive 18 degrees. Elias Thorne did not rest. Armed with a heavy, forged steel spade and a worn pickaxe, he began executing a blueprint of vernacular engineering passed down from his grandfather, a man who had survived the ruthless winters of the old country by bending the earth to his will rather than fighting the sky. Elias was not simply digging a hole, he was constructing a geothermal timber trench. To the untrained eye, it looked like a shallow grave. But mathematically, it was a precise thermodynamic engine designed to manipulate the Earth's natural thermal mass and utilize gravity to defeat moisture. He excavated a trench precisely 4 feet deep, 12 feet long, and 4 feet wide, removing over 190 cubic feet of dense, clay-heavy Dakota soil by hand. It was grueling, back-breaking labor that left his palms covered in broken, bleeding blisters, wrapped in dirty canvas. But the brutal arithmetic of the frontier demanded payment in sweat or blood, and Elias chose sweat. The genius of the trench lay in its specific elevations. Elias did not dig a flat floor. Using a crude plumb bob and a spirit level borrowed from a deceased neighbor's estate, he graded the bottom of the trench with a strict 3-degree pitch, sloping downward toward the natural drainage basin of the nearby creek. He then hauled 5 wheelbarrow loads of smooth, sorted river stone, ranging from 1 to 3 inches in diameter, and laid a porous 6-inch bed of gravel across the sloped floor. This was the first layer of his defense, the capillary break. If any groundwater seeped into the trench, the irregular spacing of the stones would instantly break the hydrostatic pressure, preventing capillary action from wicking moisture upward into his wood supply. The gravity-fed drainage pitch ensured that stray water would weep away from the timber, rather than pooling beneath it. Next came the airflow system. A stagnant underground hole would simply breed white rot and fungus. Elias needed convection. At the low end of the trench, he installed a vertical 8-inch diameter hollowed-out ash log, acting as a cold air intake. At the high end, nearest the cabin, he built a 12-inch square flue out of fieldstone and clay mortar, extending 2 feet above the ground. Finally, the roof. He bridged the 4-foot span of the trench with rough-hewn 2x6 joists salvaged from an abandoned homesteader's collapsed barn, spacing them exactly 16 inches on center to bear the anticipated load of heavy winter snow. Over these joists, he laid a tight lattice of willow branches, followed by an improvised vapor control layer, oil-soaked canvas tarps, and a thick matting of dry prairie hay. To finish the structure, he piled 18 inches of packed earth over the top, stamping it down until it formed a solid, slightly crowned mound that would shed rain. The only access was a heavy, insulated wooden trapdoor positioned just 5 feet from the back door of his cabin, allowing him to retrieve wood without exposing himself to the open prairie winds. What Elias had built was a subterranean seasoning kiln driven by passive physics. Above ground, the ambient air temperature could plummet to 40 degrees, freezing cellular sap into solid ice. But beneath the frost line, which, in early winter, only penetrated the first 12 to 18 inches of topsoil, the earth possessed massive thermal inertia. The deep soil acted as a battery, storing the heat of the summer sun. Down at the bottom of Elias's 4-foot trench, the ambient temperature remained remarkably stable, hovering between 45 and 50 degrees, completely insulated from the violent temperature swings of the surface. This thermal stability was the key to unlocking the BTUs trapped in his green, freshly cut cottonwood. Because the wood was kept in a 50-degree environment, the sap never froze. It remained liquid, but liquid moisture still had to be removed. This is where the physics of convection currents and the stack effect took over. The cold, dry winter air above ground, often carrying a relative humidity of less than 20%, was heavy and dense. It naturally sank down the hollow ash log at the low end of the trench. As this bone-dry air entered the 50-degree Dieckhoff trench, it warmed up. According to the laws of thermodynamics, as air warms, its capacity to hold moisture increases dramatically. This warmed air moved slowly through the precisely stacked logs, pulling the liquid moisture out of the green wood through evaporation. As the air absorbed the water vapor, it became lighter and more buoyant, naturally rising up and exhausting out the taller fieldstone chimney at the high end. Without burning a single piece of fuel, Elias had created a continuous, gravity-powered vacuum of airflow that managed the dew point perfectly. He was actively drying and seasoning his green timber in the middle of a freezing winter, a feat the conventional builders considered absolutely impossible. But the frontier was not kind to innovators, and it was deeply suspicious of the unorthodox. On November 21st, needing a few extra yards of canvas to seal his trapdoor, Elias walked the 4 miles into town to visit Obadiah Cobb's General Mercantile. Cobb was a rigid, severe man of 50, whose ledger book was his Bible. He had built his wealth on the exorbitant interest rates he charged desperate homesteaders. "I need 3 yards of oiled canvas, Mr. Cobb," Elias said, placing 2 $1 coins on the glass counter. "I'm short on the total, but I can offer you a cord of seasoned wood by mid-January to cover the rest." Cobb peered over his wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes flat and devoid of empathy. "Seasoned wood, you say? The whole town has seen you burying green cottonwood in a mud hole, boy. Mud-soaked timber won't pay a debt. That wood will be rotted pulp by Christmas, and you'll be frozen stiff in that cabin. I don't extend credit to dead men, and I don't trade for swamp rot." Cobb swept the coins back toward Elias. Buy what you can afford, or step aside. Elias took his coins and left. The humiliation burned, but he swallowed it. Pride did not generate BTUs. 3 days later, on November 24th, Hiram Fletcher, the region's most prolific traditional builder, rode past the Thorne homestead on his way to inspect a barn roof. Hiram was a man who believed the old ways were the only ways. He pulled his draft horse to a halt, staring in disbelief at the mound of dirt hiding Elias's fuel supply. "Elias!" Hiram shouted, shaking his head. "What in God's name possesses you? Wood goes against the cabin wall. The proper build is tight against the siding. It acts as a windbreak. It adds a layer of insulation to your interior walls. You're inviting earth damp and ruin by burying it. You're fighting the natural order of things." "With respect, Mr. Fletcher," Elias replied, leaning on his shovel. "Wood against the cabin wall traps snowmelt against the foundation joists. It invites rot into the sill plates, and green wood left in the wind freezes solid." Hiram scoffed loudly, a harsh sound in the crisp air. "Your father was a stubborn fool, too. Let's see how warm your theories keep you when the January gales hit. What you don't understand, boy, is that you can't hide from the winter." Hiram rode off, leaving Elias standing alone beside his earth-sheltered trench. The contrast across the prairie was stark. 2 miles to the east, Silas Vance, the wealthy cattleman, sat comfortably in his parlor, glancing out his window at his monumental $36 woodpile. It was perfectly stacked, a massive wall of premium oak exposed to the open sky. Silas believed his money had purchased absolute security. He believed his sheer volume of fuel was an impenetrable shield against the coming cold. He didn't consider the cellular mechanics of wood, nor did he calculate the thermal lag of the earth. He simply trusted the aesthetic of a massive traditional woodpile. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne's yard looked empty, save for a strange, snow-dusted mound of earth near his back door. He had no towering stacks of wood to boast of. He had only a meticulously engineered subterranean chamber, silently exhaling a faint whisper of moisture-laden air through a fieldstone chimney. The skeptics laughed. They drank their warm coffee and placed their bets on how quickly the Thorne boy would abandon his freezing claim and beg for charity. What Hiram Fletcher, Obadiah Cobb, and Silas Vance didn't understand was that the real danger of the frontier wasn't the cold earth beneath their feet. The real danger was the moisture trapped in the sky, and the catastrophic, physics-defying arrogance of leaving one's survival exposed to the whims of the atmosphere. The trap was set. The physics were locked in place. All that was missing was the test, and the test was currently brewing over the Arctic Circle, gathering an ungodly amount of atmospheric pressure, preparing to descend upon the Dakota Territory with a fury unseen in a generation. The Dakota Territory did not issue warnings. It simply executed its judgments. On January 14, 1881, the region awoke to an eerie, deceptive dawn. The temperature had inexplicably climbed to 38 Tordarer, melting the top layer of frost into a slick, muddy slurry. For the skeptics, it felt like a reprieve. But for anyone who understood the barometric arithmetic of the frontier, the sudden, unnatural stillness was terrifying. The atmospheric pressure was plummeting so rapidly that homesteaders reported a physical aching in their eardrums. By 2 p.m., the sky did not just darken, it bruised. A massive, low-pressure system colliding with an Arctic high-pressure ridge created a localized weather anomaly of devastating proportions. The temperature collapsed. It did not drop steadily. It fell off a cliff. In less than 45 minutes, the ambient air temperature plummeted from a thawing 38 degrees to a bone-snapping 5 degrees. The immediate result was a torrential downpour of freezing rain and heavy sleet. For 2 hours, the sky unloaded millions of gallons of supercooled liquid that instantly flash-froze upon contact with the ground, the cabins, and most critically, the exposed woodpiles. Then, the wind arrived. At 4:15 p.m., the northwest horizon vanished behind a wall of moving white. The wind velocity accelerated from a dead calm to sustained gales of 45 miles per hour, carrying blinding, pulverized snow. The hard winter of 1881 had officially unleashed its apex predator. By 6:00 p.m., the temperature had reached 12 degrees, and the brutal physics of the plains began to dismantle the arrogance of the traditionalists. 2 miles east of the Thorne claim, Silas Vance, wrapped in his heavy buffalo coat, stepped off his porch to retrieve a week's worth of fuel from his massive $36 premium oak woodpile. He carried a kerosene lantern and a steel pry bar. What he found in the howling dark was not a woodpile, but a monument of ice. The afternoon's freezing rain had saturated the exposed end grain of his perfectly stacked timber. When the flash freeze hit, that water expanded by 9%. The moisture inside the cellular xylem of the wood locked solid, while the exterior of the pile was entombed beneath a 4-inch thick sheet of clear, impenetrable ice. Silas swung his steel pry bar. Clang! The metal bounced off the frozen oak, vibrating violently up his arms. He swung again, harder, desperation fueling his muscles. He managed to chip away a fragment of ice, but the logs themselves were welded together by frozen sap and sleet. They were heavier than concrete. He spent 45 minutes in the blinding, 12-degree wind, managing to liberate only 3 pitifully small logs before the biting frost in his fingers forced him to retreat indoors. Nature did not care about Silas Vance's wealth. The sky had audited his ledger, and his premium wood was functionally useless. By 11:00 p.m., the storm reached its terrifying climax. The ambient temperature was a lethal 38 degrees. The wind was registering catastrophic gusts of over 55 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to a point where exposed flesh would freeze in less than 2 minutes. Inside Obadiah Cobb's mercantile, the situation was descending into a thermodynamic nightmare. Cobb had managed to bring a dozen green, snow-covered logs inside before the storm peaked. He threw them into his massive cast-iron belly stove, expecting the roar of a life-saving fire. Instead, he triggered a negative BTU loop. The physics of burning frozen wood is an exercise in futility governed by the latent heat of vaporization. The small bed of coals in Cobb's stove immediately attacked the frozen logs. But before the wood could ignite and release heat into the room, the fire had to expend nearly all its energy to perform a phase change. It had to melt the internal ice into water, and then boil that liquid water into steam. This process required 970 BTUs of energy per pound of water, just to convert the moisture to vapor. The stove, rather than acting as a radiant heater, became a massive energy sink. The internal temperature of the firebox plummeted below the critical 250-degree mark. The flames choked, turning from a vibrant, heat-producing orange to a dark, smoking red. Inside the mercantile, the ambient temperature dropped with terrifying speed. 45 degrees, then 35 degrees. By midnight, it was 28 degrees inside the building. The moisture boiling out of the logs hit the freezing air of the room, raising the indoor humidity drastically. This moisture immediately sought the coldest surfaces, the single-pane glass windows and the iron nail heads in the walls, where it rapidly condensed and froze. Frost began to literally creep up the interior walls of the mercantile. Cobb, shivering violently beneath 3 wool blankets, watched his breath form clouds in his own parlor. His proper, traditional methods were killing him. Across town, Hiram Fletcher, the master builder, was faring no better. His wood, stacked tightly against the exterior of his cabin to block the wind, had trapped the afternoon's sleet against his siding. The snow drifts, manipulated by the aerodynamic block of the woodpile, curled over and buried his entire supply under 4 feet of packed heavy drift snow. He was burning his wooden dining chairs just to keep his hands from going numb. 3 miles away, completely isolated in the blinding whiteout, 16-year-old Elias Thorne sat in his father's old wooden rocking chair. He was not wearing a coat. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt. Inside Elias's cabin, The ambient temperature was a perfectly stable 65-degree Celsius. The wind shrieked against the clapboard siding, shaking the small structure, but the cold could not penetrate the thermodynamic fortress Elias had built. As the fire in his cast-iron stove burned down to a bed of glowing ruby-red coals, Elias did not bundle up to face the storm. He simply stood, walked to the small mudroom at the back of his cabin, and lifted the heavy, canvas-insulated trapdoor in the floor. A gentle updraft of air met his face. It was not freezing. It was exactly 50 degrees. Beneath his feet, his geothermal timber trench was performing flawlessly. Up on the surface, the 18 inches of packed earth and the thick matting of prairie hay were acting as a massive thermal blanket. The 2x6 rough-hewn joists, spaced strictly at 16 inches on center, easily bore the crushing 40-pound per square foot live load of the accumulated snow. Elias reached down into the dark, subterranean chamber and pulled up a piece of the green cottonwood he had buried 2 months prior. It was shockingly light. Over the past 8 weeks, the trench had operated exactly as his grandfather's vernacular engineering dictated. The heavy, bone-dry winter air had sunk into the intake log, warmed up in the 50-degree geothermal ambient heat of the trench, absorbed the cellular moisture from the green wood, and exhausted out the fieldstone chimney via the stack effect. The wood had not rotted. The constant gravity-fed convection current had prevented any stagnant dampness. Elias threw the log into the stove. There was no hissing. There was no smoldering smoke. Because the wood was already at 50 degrees and devoid of water weight, it ignited in less than 30 seconds. The fire rapidly climbed to 450 degrees, radiating a massive clean wave of pure BTUs directly through the cast iron and into the small cabin. The brutal arithmetic of the frontier was clear. Silas Vance and Obadiah Cobb were fighting the sky and losing. Elias Thorne had partnered with the earth, and he was warm. The blizzard raged for 36 relentless hours. It buried the Dakota Territory beneath drifts that swallowed entire barns and erased the topography of the plains. When the wind finally broke at dawn on January 16th, the silence that followed was heavy and lethal. The temperature remained at a paralyzing 20°C, but the sky cleared, revealing a blinding, sunlit landscape of white. Inside his frozen mansion, Silas Vance was broken. He had spent the last 12 hours burning his expensive oak furniture, his wife's imported picture frames, and the floorboards of his own pantry. His premium 36-ton woodpile remained an untouchable glacier of ice outside his door. The internal temperature of his home was 24 degrees. His pride was gone, replaced by the primal, overriding terror of freezing to death in his own parlor. Wrapped in every blanket he owned, Silas forced his way out his front door, plunging into waist-deep snow. He looked toward the horizon, expecting to see the chimneys of his neighbors standing cold and dead. But 3 miles to the west, rising steadily against the pale blue, freezing sky, was a thick, confident plume of white smoke. It was not the dark, smoldering gray of wet wood, nor the thin, desperate wisp of a dying ember. It was the thick, robust, continuous exhaust of a fire burning at maximum efficiency, driven by perfectly dry fuel. It was coming from the Thorne claim. Silas Vance, the man who had laughed at a grieving 16-year-old boy, the man who had mocked the mud-soaked timber and prophesied Elias's frozen corpse, began to wade through the snowdrifts toward that smoke. He was not going to mock. He was not going to lecture. He was going to beg. Nature doesn't care about your pride, and physics is the only judge that matters. And the judge had just handed down its verdict. The morning of January 16, 1881, was blindingly bright, utterly still, and perilously cold. The ambient temperature held at a stagnant 20 degrees. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a reshaped world of towering white drifts that buried fences, wagons, and the hubris of the frontier elite. It took Silas Vance nearly 2 hours to traverse the 3 miles from his freezing mansion to the Thorne homestead. His buffalo hide coat was stiff with frost, his extremities numb, his lungs burning with every intake of the crystalline air. When he finally crested the small rise overlooking Elias's property, he stopped, leaning heavily on a walking stick. The Thorne cabin was not buried under the fatal aerodynamic snowdrifts that had plagued Hiram Fletcher's properly built home. Because Elias had not stacked wood against his exterior walls, the fierce winds of the blizzard had scoured the snow cleanly around the structure, leaving the cabin exposed but completely accessible. And rising from the fieldstone chimney of the geothermal timber trench was the steady, rhythmic exhalation of warm, moist air, proof that the subterranean engine was still running. Silas approached the back door and knocked. When 16-year-old Elias opened it, a wave of 65-degree air rolled out, washing over Silas's frozen face. It was the smell of dry, perfectly combusting cottonwood and warm chicory coffee. Silas looked past the boy. He saw no massive stacks of wood. He only saw the open trapdoor in the floorboard, revealing the dark 50-degree caustica for earthen chamber below, where dry, unfrozen timber lay in neat, meticulously engineered rows. "I burned my dining table last night, Elias," Silas rasped, his voice stripped of all its former booming arrogance. He pulled off his heavy leather mitten, revealing fingers pale and stiff with the onset of frostnip. "My premium oak is a glacier. I cannot break it. My wife is shivering in her bed beneath a pile of rugs." Silas reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a leather coin purse. "I will pay you $2 a cord, whatever you can spare." Elias looked at the wealthy cattleman. He felt no desire to gloat. The frontier was too deadly for petty vengeance. But the brutal arithmetic of survival demanded fairness. "The railroad town price is $4.50, Mr. Vance, and my wood is dry. I will sell you 2 cords for $5 each, and you will haul it yourself." Silas Vance, a man who had mocked the boy just 2 months prior, did not argue. He simply nodded, the fight completely drained from him by the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics. By the end of the week, the word had spread across the fractured, frozen community. The boy with the mud-soaked timber was the only homesteader within a 10-mile radius who possessed dry, instantly combustible fuel. Obadiah Cobb, the rigid mercantile owner who had refused Elias credit, was forced to make the same humiliating trek. Cobb's own conventional woodpile had proven completely useless, and the interior of his store had suffered thousands of dollars in water damage from the frost melting off his interior walls. Elias walked into Cobb's mercantile on January 22nd, pulling a sled loaded with half a cord of perfectly seasoned subterranean cottonwood. He walked directly to the counter and looked Cobb in the eye. "I owe you $11.45 for my father's coffin and the doctor's fee," Elias stated, his voice calm and authoritative. "I am selling this wood at emergency rates, $7 a cord. I will deliver 2 full cords to your back door by nightfall. That clears my debt, leaves me a credit of $2.55, and keeps your store from freezing solid." Cobb, huddled over a sputtering, smoke-filled stove, slowly opened his ledger. With a trembling, ink-stained hand, he drew a thick black line through the name Thorne, Elias. "Account settled," Cobb muttered, unable to meet the boy's gaze. In a matter of days, Elias had not only survived the deadliest storm of the decade, but he had leveraged his vernacular engineering to completely erase his debt and secure enough capital to purchase seed for the spring planting. He had conquered the winter not with money, but with applied physics. The town stopped laughing. By the autumn of 1881, Hiram Fletcher, the traditional builder who had confidently predicted Elias's demise, could be seen quietly digging a 4-foot-deep trench behind his own cabin, carefully measuring a 3-degree drainage pitch. Elias Thorne's geothermal timber trench was not a localized fluke. It was a masterclass in what we now call vernacular architecture and passive thermodynamic engineering. Today, modern architects and engineers utilize the exact same physical principles Elias harnessed in 1880 to build some of the most advanced, energy-efficient structures on the planet. The concept of using the Earth's stable 50 to 55 degree F subterranean temperature is the foundational principle behind modern, Earth-sheltered homes and geothermal heating loops. By burying infrastructure below the frost line, modern engineers exploit the Earth's massive thermal lag, shielding vulnerable systems from the violent atmospheric swings of the surface. Furthermore, Elias's gravity-fed convection system, drawing heavy, dry, cold air down, warming it, and allowing it to absorb moisture before exhausting it upward, is the exact same thermodynamic cycle used in modern, multi-million-dollar commercial lumber kilns. The only difference is that modern kilns use massive electric fans and mechanical dehumidifiers to force the airflow. Elias achieved the exact same moisture management, managing the dew point and relative humidity, using nothing but the passive stack effect, an empty ash log, and a fieldstone chimney. He did not fight the environment, he judo flipped it. He used the extreme cold of the surface to create the pressure differential needed to drive his subterranean airflow. He turned the winter into the engine of his own survival. Elias Thorne never left the Dakota Territory. The boy who was nearly orphaned and bankrupted by the frontier grew into a man who commanded it. He took his $2.55 credit, bought spring wheat seed, and slowly expanded his 160-acre claim. As the decades passed, he became renowned not just as a successful farmer, but as a master builder. When new immigrants arrived on the plains, terrified of the impending winters, Elias was the man they sought. He taught them the mathematics of thermal mass. He taught them the vital importance of capillary breaks and moisture management. He taught them that wood stacked against a wall is a tombstone and that the earth is a battery waiting to be tapped. According to county archives, Elias Thorne lived a long, prosperous life. He passed away peacefully in his sleep on March 4, 1948, at the age of 84. The cabin he built with his father was long gone, replaced by a sturdy, permanent home, but in the backyard, beneath a thick layer of prairie grass, the subtle depression of a 12-foot trench still remained. The story of the 16-year-old boy who hid his firewood in a drainage trench is a testament to the ultimate rule of the wild. Society may run on wealth, status, and popular opinion. People may laugh, they may mock, and they may judge you by the size of your woodpile or the weight of your coin purse. But when the sky turns dark, when the temperature plummets, and when the brutal arithmetic of the frontier comes to collect its due, nature doesn't care about your pride. Physics is the only judge that matters. And those who understand the rules are the ones who get to see the spring. If you found value in this story, hit that like button to help others find these stories of creativity. Subscribe to preserve this knowledge.